Your host in Hiroshima. And today I have the pleasure once again of talking with the amazing James Hollow in Tokyo, who is the CEO and founder of Fabric. Thanks so much for joining, James.
The pleasure's all mine, JJ. Thank you so much for having me back.
It's wonderful. And we actually had the chance to meet in person. I saw your great offices right under the train line in Nakameguro. You're doing a lot of great stuff. You're actually expanding those offices there, aren't you?
That's right. Thanks so much for coming to visit us when you're up in Tokyo. That was a real treat, and it feels very different now that we've met in person in a really good way. So thanks again for that. And you're right. We've expanded. We've taken on the unit next to our first office in Nakameguro there, and we've actually just about finished developing that. It was a sort of had lots of wood unconstructed, didn't it, when you were there? So it's now looking really nice, and that's our basic community hub space that we're going to be using for doing all kinds of fun things in Nakameguro.
Wow, great. And it was fun to see that you're expanding. You're also this is what we're talking about today is one of your major projects, doing surveys with Japanese consumers about how they think about sustainability. This is the second time we've talked about this, so we're going to see how things have changed over 1 year. Isn't that right?
That's right. That's right. So in 2021, we did a big survey and also some qualitative research, ethnographic work going with shoppers, consumers, real people, and looking at the kind of decisions that they made and to what extent they were being framed around sustainability. And we put that out as a report, I think, in early summer last year, and I had the chance to share that with your channel, JJ, a bit later on. So we've basically updating that. The survey again is a big focus. We've actually expanded that, as we'll see, to cover essentially a bigger proportion of the population, and really trying to see what's changed in that year, but also looking into some other areas of that. Particularly, we won't maybe go into so much into this, but when the report comes out, so this is a bit of a teaser today, actually, of the data, looking into the food system and how the food system's kind of leading the way in terms of how conscious consumers are driving brand futures. Yeah, so we're really excited about the results, and it'd be great to get some good conversations going and questions from your audience today, JJ.
Yeah, I hope if anybody has any questions or comments along the way, please make sure and write them in the chat. So this initial page here says SOS and FOF. Do you want to just explain what that means?
Yeah, that's kind of like our internal, it's sort of code name for the project, basically. So last year, the report was called State of Sustainability. And we've added to that a look into the future of food. So those are what that stands for. But I think once the report gets published, it'll have a slightly more catchy title.
That's
But yeah,
interesting, though, that you found some indicators in terms of how Japanese consumers value food, because I also found that in reading news reports about food is the one area they're willing to spend more money on and invest in organic and fair trade. So you actually, we're going to talk about that a bit later, but it looks like you found some consistent data about that.
totally. I think food is going to be maybe the sort of vanguard category. And there are a few hypotheses we have. I mean, the data we've got is showing that. And I think if you think about the choices people make, when there's a really tangible benefit to you, the purchaser, that's great, right? You're more likely to buy that product. When it's a benefit for, let's say, an environment or a species, that can be very motivating for some, but it's a little less tangible. But if you can combine the benefits for the environment and the benefits for yourself, often as health benefits, with more nutrition, better taste, then it's a win-win. And I think that sort of win-win is going to be really fundamental to for brands as they basically redesign their products, services, and the business models behind them throughout this transition. And actually, food, the synergy is already there. Like if you treat the soil well, if you treat the animals well, that you are what you eat eats, and that goes for not just animals, right? So if you've creating a nice environment in the agricultural production space, then it usually comes through as benefits for the consumer in that way. And so that's, I think, one of the core reasons why it's kind of coming out of the gates first, in terms of a sustainable transition of that. It's not huge, right? And I think a lot of what we're talking about, we don't want to oversell it because it's kind of the beginning of the journey, but we are definitely seeing it.
But you're seeing small changes. Charles McJilton, who runs Second Harvest Japan, yesterday was talking about food insecurity and food loss in Japan. And of course, that plays into how consumers are choosing food products as well, which we'll talk about a bit later.
Yeah, food loss is
It's all
massive in Japan.
very interesting.
We waste so much as a society here. It's a real tragedy, as it is around the world. I think it's 30%, 30% of food is wasted. Japan, I think, is 38% food secure. I think that might be like 2018 data, which is really low.
But also 20 million people below the poverty line. So there's a lot of people who really need a little bit of support in terms of food insecurity. It's incredible. We have Japan Trail Cam has joined. Nice to see you here. Before we dive into the data, I think this screen here tells us a little bit about what you do at Fabric. Do you want to just give us an overview before we go into the data?
Yeah, so that's our office. That's the J4 unit under the tracks in Nakameguro. We're actually the big concrete pillars there are holding up the Toyoko Sen. So do come down and visit anyone who's in the area. We'd love to meet you. We formed Fabric last year in the spring. And what, we were really responding to what we saw as a fundamental shift in sort of the society and the economy towards what we've described as a new social fabric, where, basically brands need to enable culture, build strong, sustainable relationships or relationships based on sustainability with their customers, and to really act on sustainability. So sustainability isn't the only thing that we do. We work as business consultants with projects that aren't framed around that. But, in the long term, essentially good long-term business strategy has to be sustainable. Otherwise, we have to change business as usual. So that's the concept behind Fabric. And we recognize and are building on, these ideas like Sampo Yoshi, which essentially means three ways good. I know you've talked a lot around people, planet, and profit, and getting those aligned. These principles have been in Japan a long time, but I think they haven't been at the center of business models, and that's a big part of what we're helping companies redesign.
It's interesting because this also came up yesterday. There's a lot of resistance when you talk with people in Japan sometimes about taking responsibility for making better choices, which are better for the environment, better for community. And quite a lot of people still think that all businesses in Japan are doing Sampo Yoshi, are taking care of the environment, taking care of society as a way of doing business without thinking about their personal responsibility. And I think that is a great legacy for Japanese business, but it also makes it difficult when we're in a situation now where not all businesses are doing that. And there is some, I think you call it agency in your data about how consumers can make positive change by making better choices, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a real sort of crux, isn't it, of the issue in Japan. I think we've kind of got used to just expecting government and business to take care of it. And I think, lots of Japanese companies, there are more, companies here that are more than 200 years old than anywhere else in the world. I think there are a lot of leaders within Japan's sort of blend of stakeholder and stakeholder capitalism that sort of, it is capitalism, but of a slightly different kind, who would look at themselves as taking responsibility for society, but often it's just Japanese society, and a lot of the negative effects of their business models are overseas, or they're intangible, like carbon dioxide pollution, etc. And so, I think Japan does have a great opportunity, and as a society, a lot of strengths that it can use throughout this transition. But I think, you know, we have been complacent and we haven't exercised our agency as consumers to push for change. And maybe that's starting to change a little bit. Yeah, hopefully we can. We're looking at some early signs, I think.
That's so interesting. You were talking about just focused on the Japanese market. One of the things Stefan Ledoux said from Kodo Advisory when I talked to him is he sees a lot of change happening because of Japan's connections to international businesses and collaborations with businesses abroad who have higher standards and higher regulations from those countries. And so they're influencing Japan in that business sense. And what I'm seeing as well through tourism is the international customer coming in through tourism, or the new international resident, also has higher expectations. So we're seeing in a bunch of different ways how there might be more movement in sustainability and how consumers think in Japan.
Totally.
From
Yeah, Stefan's talk was
variety.
great. I was nodding all the way through it. I mean, he's obviously focused on the financial sector, where the pressure on financial organizations like banks to clean up their holdings and what they fund, it, you know, has started, you know, probably 3, 4, 5, even 5 years ago. But it's really, that's sending a kind of a shockwave, isn't it, through the financial industry and beyond, to do ESG reporting, and to really be clear on, you know, what impacts your supply chain are having, or, you know, what you're investing in. So that, I think, sustainability, and again, you know, we looked into this. Sustainability is a sort of a natural disposition in Japan, but actually, the last sort of post-war economic growth didn't really have those principles embedded in it so much, and hence sustainability has kind of arrived like a sort of mini armada of mini black ships, you know, really as a foreign concept, with foreign words and different ways of actually trying to measure it, with the 17 SDGs and then how they're encoded into the ESG frameworks. And Japanese businesses are really struggling to deal with that. It requires an awful lot of administration and data to actually work out exactly what your impacts are. And to be honest, I think I'm not necessarily the best person to talk to about this, but we haven't. What has changed is they're now doing a lot of ESG reporting. Are they actually doing any actions that are minimizing their impacts or having a positive impact? Not so much, is my opinion. And within the current system, they kind of get points for, they get sustainability brownie points essentially for doing the reporting, but they're not actually taking any action yet, in general. So it really is kind of from here, korekara, that. But you know, I think there is a both. Stefan talked really well to that necessity, right, to not get sort of left behind, because it's going to, the way that Europe and parts of America are leading on this issue, that, you know, in order for that machine parts company to be able to sell its parts to, you know, manufacturers in Germany, they're going to have to be able to explain what steel they're using, what's the carbon intensity of that steel. If it's exporting food, it's got to be really clear what the conditions are where it's being grown, etc., etc. So it is a sort of business
And how your operations are powered. He was saying is a big deal. So if all of your power comes from coal, that's not good enough, right? And what you're doing, showing that Japanese consumers actually are starting to think more, as you see, you know, very slight trends, but you are seeing some movement even in the Japanese market, which a lot of Japanese business owners often say to me when I say, you got to start thinking about it. They're always like, the domestic market, the Japanese consumers don't really care about it. And I mean, like you said before, the differences are very slight in how things are changing, how consumers are thinking, but there is change. So let's talk about some of the findings that you had.
That's right. So, you know, we're just talking there about the Japanese business industry as a whole. Our focus is on what we call the B2C brands, the business to consumer brands. And, you know, we basically know that for businesses that need to transition to a sustainable model, they need to make those changes relevant and ideally valuable to their consumers. Otherwise, it's going to be really tough. And there's going to be a massive advantage for companies which find synergies between their sustainable transition and the value proposition for their consumers. And to be honest, we didn't know either. Going into that study that's put there 2021 March, we weren't sure. We'd heard a lot of people expressing hunches. The one you often hear is like it's low, but Gen Z are really interested in it, which is the kind of what is asserted about the transition in the so-called West. And we really wanted to understand, get to the bottom of that. So that study, as I said, it was combined with ethnographic research, but the core survey component was 5,200 respondents, 18 to 65. And so we updated that in April with actually a bigger panel, 6,800. That's really robust from a survey point of view. If you're not familiar with these things, governments would often base policy on smaller panels than that. So that's really robust sample size, and it's from 15 to 69. And one of the reasons we did that is to really capture the Gen Z audience, which they're now teaching SDGs in high school, and they are participants in the society, so get their opinion in there. And also we were seeing a really sort of actually quite a strong consciousness amongst the boomer generation. And so although 69 doesn't capture that massive population in Japan completely, it gives us a clearer picture, and that's basically the extent to which our online survey platform allows. So it's a really and it's a big study, 120 questions.
Each year was the same 120 questions, or did the questions shift at all, or anything added?
Yeah, so the core ones are the same, and that gives us our longitudinal data set. It allows us to make essentially comparisons, which you'll see quite a lot of in the data today, of the same questions being asked and how that changed. But we also, for instance, with this year, as I mentioned, we're looking into food systems more. So we switched out some of the questions from last year with different ones. But yeah, so we'll be very clear, I think, here. So this question here is, when you hear the term sustainability, what comes to mind? And just sort of thinking what that means, it's quite a linguistic question, right? Because you could be deeply involved with regional vitality, and that could have been your life work, which is a fundamental sustainability question, but not be linking that to the word sustainability in Japanese, jizokanose, or sustainability in katakana, and therefore basically answering none of the above, which you can see at the bottom. Last year it was actually the biggest response when asked which of these do you associate with sustainability. And just to be clear, there are about 17 here. They're essentially the 17 SDGs put into layman terms. What you can see, it's quite a lot going on here, but let me unpack it a little bit. The 2021 responses, you can see, are the bars, which in general, and I think everything except none of the above, are lower. And so for 2022, the fact that you're going, let's say, for protecting life below water, from, it's a little bit blurry, but say 24 to 30%, that's showing that basically the Japanese population is catching up in terms of connecting this concept of sustainability to these broad range of issues that have been defined by the UN for nations to track their performance, and for the rest of us also to reference. We've done a little bit of color coding here, so you can see the sort of like the olive green ones are ones which feel pretty environmental. Of course, you lift up the sort of the bonnet on one of those, and there's a bunch of social issues right there underneath. And the opposite way around, the blue ones are more on the social side, but obviously they're interconnected with environmental issues as well. And you can see this bias, apart from eliminate poverty, 5 of the top 6 are sort of environmental ones. And I think that's symptomatic of the fact that sustainability is kind of the new word for eco in Japan for a lot of people. And of course, we know that that's not the case, that it's it's environment and social in balance. And then the purpley ones, eliminate hunger, protecting life on land. That actually should be green. This is very fresh. Eliminate hunger is a good example of one that sort of, it's so tied between environment and social. It couldn't be one or the other. It has to be both. So yeah, that's some really interesting and if you care about sustainability and the future of life in Japan, it's good to see this growing sort of understanding and familiarity with these concepts. You'll notice the red
Ooh,
dots. I wonder if you
interesting.
worked
Yeah.
out what they meant, JJ. Let me just shut the window. There's a digger that's just,
Okay. Okay.
I don't know if it's distracting me anyway.
Yeah. The thing that I found really interesting here, and often when you talk about SDGs in Japan, is how people think about SDGs as related only to things outside Japan. Did you have a sense, James, in doing this survey that people were thinking of these SDGs as problems outside Japan or things that included Japan?
Yeah, I think that's a really astute observation. I do think SDGs have are essentially a foreign import, um, and it's some of the language maybe doesn't connect to what these more traditional ideas of sustainability in Japan. But I think, and that was reflected in what's still quite low levels right here. So I think the average overall might be in the low 20s. We haven't got a data set to compare this for the UK or Germany or the US, for instance, but I'm pretty sure it would be higher. But I also think that you can see that's a pretty significant change. From a business marketing point of view, a shift from 24 to 30% in 1 year is really significant.
Yeah. Definitely. We've got some interesting comments. Tova says, for the none of the above option, did you collect any comments on what they were thinking of?
Hey Tova, thanks for tuning in. That's a really really good question. I don't think we had an open field for this, so I think that's a no. So I imagine though that there are lots of ways that people are conscious and working towards a sustainable Japan. Let's say the regional vitality. JJ, a lot of your work down in Hiroshima around sustainable tourism. There might be people there who are working really hard to create sustainable travel experiences, who might not be connecting it with the kind of concepts here, even though they are connected. So I think it's a sort of a literacy question, and it would be
It's
quite hard
yeah,
for the respondents to sort of say, oh yeah, but it would be an interesting question, Tova. Let's do that. Let's do that. Let's do
yeah.
another survey together. I just noticed Andreas has joined as well. Hey, nice. Thanks for joining, Andreas. We've got to catch
Oh,
up
yeah,
soon.
great to see you. Also, LinkedIn. We have a question from Japan Trail Cam. Seems like a big change from 2021 to 2022. And the 6,000 people, 5,000 people plus in the first year. These are slight changes, but it's nice to see that 2022, you do have more awareness and a bit more understanding. Can we generalize in that way, James?
I mean, how can we interpret survey results, right?
Yeah.
It's a, I think you have to be cautious with over interpretation, and I think it's in terms of the methodology, it's very very rigorous. For instance, all the question order is randomized automatically. I mean, that's a standard approach. But I think what we're seeing is a really kind of consistent picture for this shift. And maybe if we go through some of the other data, you'll see that sort of consistency come through. So that question there is looking specifically at this sort of familiarity with the SDG concepts and how that shifted. But actually, yeah, if you could just go back to the one with the 6 dimensions there. So it's quite hard to ask around the all 17 SDGs, but what we try to do is basically create these 6 areas and group them under those and use these as the sort of 6 fundamental dimensions of sustainability, and then try and find a way of basically scoring people on their consciousness of the issues. And we felt that was kind of really fundamental and important to understanding the transition. So an example might be, if you're looking at someone buying coffee, a cup of coffee in a coffee shop, so like the most ubiquitous sort of act of purchase in Japan today potentially, and someone's gets recommended a fair trade, bird friendly bean that matches their taste profile. Now, if they are not aware of the potential for coffee plantations to have a negative effect on the environment, or on to have unfair labor practices and potentially abusive practices in that supply chain, then you're not going to sort of really, you couldn't say they're engaging with a sustainable proposition in that purchase event, that moment. But if they are aware and they make that connection and they like the taste, and the next time, they like the feeling of not having any guilt about the people or animals or environment that was damaged in the process of getting them that delicious brew to them that morning, then they might buy the same one again. And actually, that would become a sort of preference for them, that they then seek out bird-friendly, fair trade coffee in the future. And that's the kind of way that we as sort of consumers and categories become transformed and make choices around sustainable options. And so you need to have that awareness of the potential negative impacts of business, but also the potential regenerative impacts of business. And we'll see more of those, I think, in the future. And so that consciousness is fundamental, but how do you measure it in a survey? So what we basically did is create a matrix of 54 questions to really try and gauge people's the level to which they're conscious of these different issues. And then that gives us this sort of really interesting snapshot, which is the next slide, a profile essentially of the Japanese population, how conscious they are of that full range of sustainability as mapped out in those 6 dimensions. And we've got the 2 data sets here, 2021, 2022. So depending on how used to looking at data you are, you'll notice that the kind of the 2022, which is quite hard to see the color, but the purple one is the one that's generally on the right, a little bit shifted to the right. It's a bigger area because the population size is bigger, because it's 15 to 69. And yeah, there you go. And it's shifted a bit to the right, which is good, because towards the right is higher levels of consciousness. And statistically, that's the median has shifted to the right by about 1 point on this scale of -4 to 30. The mode, which is essentially the sort of the peak, has shifted 1, and the average 0.3. And I think if you look at the structure there, one of the big things is this sort of movement within that low group, which is the majority of the population still, sort of upwards, and out of this sort of negative sentiment, which like I don't really get sustainable ideas and I'm kind of rejecting them, to accepting them and increasingly sort of being aware of them. So if you look at it on that terms, you couldn't call it a sort of revolution, but it's definitely a pretty strong and steady evolution if you look at just a 12-month difference.
Yeah. A great comment from Andreas here. Many sustainability topics depend on consumption behavior. I feel Japanese consumption behavior is deeply entrenched. How can we change behavior to the better?
Well, Andreas is just a sort of a strategic brain who can answer that question. I think so. It's a great question.
In your data, we do see some indications of consumer behavior changing, right?
I think so. It's a survey is self-reported behavior, so you have to be a little bit careful. And we try not to sort of over interpret or sort of base too much in terms of looking at behavior. But I think that's the sort of thing you can track in category, like actual purchase data within categories. But it's a key question, and I think we'll look at, if you want to change behavior, first you need consciousness of the issues involved. Then you need brands to be actually providing sustainable options within that category, and then you need consumers to be kind of connecting those and feeding the personal value to them, and then using them to make brand choices and for it to be a factor in their loyalty to brands. And that's how you'll get transitions, at least within this current sort of system that we are living in. We're providing for ourselves within. So
definitely.
that's
One interesting trend. We are probably not going to have time to talk about all these amazing insights, James. Too bad. But one interesting trend which you found in your survey, both last year and this year, was that the biggest change or the biggest shift seems to be happening from older generations, not
Yeah,
necessarily the young like you see in other countries.
that's right. So this one isn't a shift from 21 to 22. It's the composition of those different consciousness levels for the 2022 data, but it's pretty similar to last year. And it's a little bit hard to compare because we broadened the age range of the study. But what you can see here is that high level, when we basically normalize for population of the group, and imagine that, like, of the 100 people, if you imagined 100 people in each group, what generation do they come from? Boomers are more like proportionately more likely to be a larger section of those higher consciousness groups. So we're seeing a bias of generation there, and it's pretty consistent for the other ones. It sort of basically, as you go from left to right, if you see millennials goes down a bit and boomers goes up a bit, and that boomer one is quite significant. So if you think of what we're doing, there's a profile. People who are conscious of a broad range of the sustainability issues will score highly. So you could have someone who's, let's say, a Gen Z who's really passionate about, let's say, sustainability in the fashion space, who could be in the low group, because they're only interested in that, and they've never had to think about the materials they use when they buy a house, or whether what energy is going to drive their mobility when they buy a car. They haven't faced those choices, they might not be aware of it. So there's, I think there is a responsibility for boomers in Japan because they've got more life experience. They also have a lot of the financial assets, and we're actually seeing that come through in their consciousness of these issues.
Yeah, interesting. And of course, this is really important for Japan because we have a majority of the population is in the older age group. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's not quite a majority, but certainly the boomer generation is over 60. I think it's now yeah, I think you're right. It's over 60. It's half the population.
It's
Not
over
quite.
half now. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. So that's really interesting to see and encouraging, I think. Now, this one, the sustainability priorities by generation is interesting. Do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so basically this is showing the kind of the profile by those 6 groups. So we didn't mention them before, but basic living needs, economic and technological development, environmental resources, equal society, protecting the natural world, and driving social development. And so this is basically the levels of consciousness within those dimensions for those 4 generational groups. It's a little hard to see the colors here, but essentially the line at the top, the highest one as it goes across, is the boomers. So you can see the biggest effect here is that basically boomers are, for each of the dimensions of sustainability, more conscious than the other groups, except for equal society, where they're pretty much all the same. But if you want to pick a winner, it's Gen Z. So for Gen Z are relatively more conscious of the equal society issues compared to the others. But it also shows it's relatively consistent. So if you're let's say a sports brand, and you're thinking, well, maybe Gen Z is our global target everywhere, and maybe in Gen Z they really over index for protecting the natural world. That's actually not the case, really. So it's a kind of an interesting result, and it shows that actually in some ways brands should feel encouraged to actually explore all of the full all 6 dimensions, the full breadth of sustainability, in order to create shared value with their customers. Brands are built on creating shared value, and actually, even if your role is, let's say, look at Nike selling selling trainers, running shoes, you can have a social impact through that, as they've done successfully, in the US, say. Whereas for Adidas, they're focusing a little bit more on, let's say, the environmental side, and sort of raising the issue of ocean plastic waste, and of recycling, and getting recycled plastic into their material streams. They're going that way, and I think we looked last year quite a lot at these different sort of strengths of brands within that, and that's that's another way that brands are going to be strategizing about this transition of where they're going to build their strengths to create that shared value with their customers.
Since you talked about how companies can adjust to change their narrative or change their branding story and how they talk about sustainability, I found this really interesting, the high sustainability engagers and how they think about advertising.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? So what we've done here is these two questions. I'm open to advertising if it is for a product I'm interested in. And then the converse, I would rather not see advertising at all. And what we've broken this down by the moderate in the gray and the high in the blue, with then everyone else in that light gray. And basically what it shows is that the people who are more conscious of sustainability issues are actually more open to advertising. They're less likely to reject advertising, which is almost the opposite to what you might expect if you believe that sort of, what's driving this change is, let's say, the Greta Thunberg generation, the sort of activist, reject the current system, anti-capitalist. In Japan, we're not really seeing that at all. It's actually the people who are most engaged with sustainability are actually most conscious, most engaged with everything. They are open to advertising. They consume a lot of media. They're very active in lots of other categories. They are, full-blown consumers, as it were. And that's, I think, a really important sort of conclusion that's becoming clear from our work. That, if you were trying to characterize the consumers, I think the next slide's got some interesting stuff on it as well. That if you're trying to characterize the movement, as it were, it's not a sort of like, let's say, impatient activist like pushing for change. It's more like sort of willing participants if the options are there. And if you can just look at this from where people were triggered to make a sustainability change, they're self-reporting TV and radio as the highest. I'm not sure, there have been SDG shows on TV, right, in the last year.
Not enough. Not
Not enough,
enough.
right?
This is something I'm saying all the time. We need to be talking about it on TV and radio. In Japan, it's still very influential across
Yeah,
age
and
groups, especially
it's a
older
danger of
generations.
there's a danger I have of only looking at the delta between years, right? And you sort of see it, and you end up sounding too positive because, as you said, none of this is enough. But it is changing in the right direction. So environmental groups are in there, particularly for the higher levels, consciousness levels. But they actually come after TV and radio, and brands are up there as well. So brands are seen as quite a trusted source of information on sustainability, which again underlines the opportunity that they have. And then you would
I was
typically see.
really surprised. Look at brands are on par with family and friends. I was
I think
really surprised for the highly engaged, right?
it's Japan. They trust brands here. And for some good reason, but not always, actually, when it comes to various topics, including sustainability. What's really interesting is influencers and personalities are not there at all. If you did this for the beauty category, influencers
Is that
would
my category? I think that's me in there. Yeah,
there
too
you go.
bad.
Well, you're the only reason it's at that level, surely, JJ.
I hope it changes, gets a little bit more influential. But yeah, are YouTubers? It's a good question, right? Are YouTubers, are Instagram influencers, are people who use social media, are they trusted in Japan? It doesn't look like it, right?
Well, not for sustainability, right? And I think to be fair to them, they maybe haven't, let's take the fashion industry or cosmetics, where Instagram influencers have massive, maybe the number one sort of most influential channel. They haven't really found their voice on sustainability, and we actually did some research for one of our clients around this. And one of the issues there is that they're just not confident, or they're not confident enough in their own understanding to feel like they can have a voice. And that sort of cautiousness, I think, is laudable. It's to be respected. They don't want to just start pronouncing stuff without really understanding it. But it sort of shows that there is let's say, an education gap to be closed, to give them the agency and empower them to actually to have more influence. to be able to praise brands when they make positive changes, and to call out others when they don't, or when they are greenwashing. And so that is, I think, if you look at the kind of a theory of change for Japan, that is a real missing link. I think you'd also point towards the press, although the TV and radio there. If you look at the role of journalists in other markets has been really important to kind of call out companies and hold them to account. In Japan, this isn't about the individuals involved. It's not that they don't want to, or that they don't have the morals to do that. It's more systemic. I think if you look at journalists, they are often rotated around the desks too soon for them to become experts in any one field. So you don't have anyone who really understands a particular field of, let's say, environmentalism or governance, to really to have a strong voices, with some notable exceptions. I think there's self-censorship that happens as well, on a systemic level, where they don't want to sort of ruffle any feathers, and there are also these sort of quite, let's potentially cynically, you could call them cozy relationships between business, government, and the press. But they also have a positive side, because if they can act towards, they can sort of move together. And I think if you look at that openness to the consumers, to being led by brands, the trust they have for them, typical of Japan, it's not going to be the same transition as you get elsewhere. This sort of like, we're in this together, willing participant, less friction. It might take a while to get going, but if it can get momentum, then it has the potential to shift quite quickly, is my sense. But maybe I'm too optimistic there. And certainly, if right now you have to say that the sort of dominant, let's say, level of sort of understanding awareness is unaware and complacent, not doing enough. But that's I think we are starting to see the change.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You're building such a great perspective from doing this research, as well as your interactions with companies about marketing and sustainability. Andrea says, for business, sustainability should simply be good business practice. It's not about tree hugging or saving resources to become more profitable. That should be the motivation for a business.
Yeah, good. I mean, sustainability strategy is just good long-term business strategy. I totally agree. But at the same time, sustainability is a hot topic. It's a word. The fact is, you didn't have to know where the steel that made your ball bearings came from, but now you do. So that it's there are sort of definite operational and changes that are happening, and for brands, brands too. But I think that we haven't. It's hard for us in our work to go into the regulatory side, but I think getting the role of government shouldn't be underestimated either. They've with the 2050 carbon neutral commitment, that's an important it's an important step. But really, I think Japan in particular, the way it's structured, the role of government regulation and sort of investment is going to be really, really key as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, so this,
absolutely. It really needs all sides. It needs the consumer activists. It needs the companies to have passionate leaders who want to change just for themselves. And you also need government regulation and outside pressure. You need it all. Now, here is really interesting, talking about consumer activism in terms of boycotting brands that have disappointed them in terms of environmental or social responsibility.
yeah, so we're getting here into this area of, we've really sort of that area of consciousness, and are you aware of the issues? And okay, now what are you going to do about that knowledge and that awareness? And so we call this agency, whether they're actually sort of using their power as consumers, their dollar voting potential. And so this is one aspect of that. Have you boycotted brands because of their poor record in environmental or social responsibility? And which has a long history, right? I think there were back to the 70s, there were mass boycott movements of really massive brands. And so what we're seeing is it's really low. There's not a sort of, that it's not zero, but there's not much of a boycott sort of culture here, which reinforces this idea of that the consumers are more sort of, let's say, somewhere between head in the sand and willing participants, shifting in that direction, rather than these sort of angry activists. But 34%, it's a really small group. That's only 3% of the entire population. You know, a third of them are reporting that they've done it, but it's still quite low. And this is when it's really useful to be able to break these responses down by these groups. You have to remember 67% are in the low group, and I think 16 in the light groups. That's really the most important shifts there.
But
Yeah,
didn't you find that the more, even though the highly engaged in sustainability thinking, they're a very small group, but they're more likely to be talking about it, to be sharing on social media, to be talking to their friends and family and people that they know about what they know about sustainable brands? Didn't we talk
we
about
did.
that last year?
Yeah, we did. Good memory. I think what the insight there was that when I said that the groups who are highly engaged and conscious of sustainability tend to be really active in general. And one of the areas they're really active is actually on social media and consuming social media. I'm not sure we've got a sort of like telling other people data point. Your memory might be better than mine, but it's consistent with the image I have in my mind of that group. They are not let's say, sort of decoupling their lifestyle from the consumer economy. They're very much engaged with media, with brands, and actually, spend a lot as well. And that's a really, maybe we shouldn't underplay that message. That's who are you going to be going after? Let's say, and the work we're doing in the cosmetic space, for instance, is the people who care most about sustainability are actually the ones with the highest buying power and share of wallet, etc. So they're really important. So yeah, we get onto this topic of how empowered they are. And so this first one is this isn't about sustainability. This is about anything, right? I can influence companies and markets by how I choose to spend my money. So that needn't be about sustainability. So if I mentioned that low and light are where the majority of the population is, that's quite sort of a low level of self-awareness of your dollar voting potential, right? Sort of 20 to 30%. But it's again higher at that higher consciousness level. If you look at that sort of that self-awareness, interesting, it's highest amongst Gen Z, which is, there aren't many areas where the Gen Z are highest. So that's at 31%. It's quite significant, but still quite low overall. And that's important context when we look at the next slide, which is more to do with sustainability, I think, to maybe influence on the environmental area, where, yeah, so you can see we can have a positive effect on the environment through the choices we make as consumers. That's a really important sort of ethic and principle that will drive category transitions. So again, in the survey, it's quite easy to say I agree with things. That's moved from 48 to 52%. So 2021, 2022, you can see the composition of that by those conscious levels here with that 48, that dotted line on the left representing. So you can see how the average has shifted up a little bit. It's pretty consistent, but it's really high, isn't it, amongst the moderate and high groups? And that's sort of, yeah, if we don't, it's maybe a little difficult to draw the conclusion that moderate and high group are the future, that what behavior and mindset we're seeing represented by them today is actually going to be where everyone's going to be at in 5 or 10 years time. I don't think we can make that conclusion, but if you have that hunch, then it's really worth thinking about how you need to be planning for the future if this is how people are going to be if they're representative of the future consumer.
I think if we compare this to the data that Stefan Ledoux has from Coda Advisory about how the influence of foreign companies on Japan companies and the Japan market shrinking and the foreign market for exports being more important, we might see bigger shifts next year with your data. It's going to be really exciting to see how this data changes next year, I think.
Yeah, he had great data, didn't he? I think he said 60% of the sales ratio for Japanese businesses was 60% foreign. I imagine most of that is actually B2B. So that's, supplying parts and that kind of thing. But, as we've said, that's actually the bit that's moving potentially, just as fast. And yeah, I think it is true that Japanese companies, 77% or something were considering increasing their sort of overseas sales strategies in the future. So
Yeah, I think there's going to be some influence, definitely, even on the Japanese consumer for imports as well as international Japanese brands which export but which have to change their narrative, their marketing strategy in terms of how they talk about sustainability as well. This is one interesting point that we've seen the numbers going down a lot when we look at data in other countries about people who feel they don't know how to impact environmental or societal problems through their consumer activism.
exactly. So it's the, the action gap. I want to, but I don't know how, because you need knowledge, and you need sort of need to be conscious of the issues, and you need to be able to interpret the sustainable propositions that a brand is presenting, and that that. But you, for the vast majority of categories in Japan today, you could probably actually not be seeing any sustainable propositions, or not knowing how to express that area of sustainability that you care about most in your everyday life. And this is a little bit like the opposite of the one before. So um, are these numbers high overall? 36%? Are they low? That's saying that sort of in general, just over a third of people are sort of feeling this frustration, which means two-thirds are not. And but we basically know that at the low level, there's very few. It's quite unlikely that they're making sustainability framed brand choices. So I think it's good to ask these questions from both sides, as it were. But I do think you could interpret this as a sort of a sign that brands actually could be doing more to provide sustainable options to consumers than they are. They tend to not. They tend to wait until they can see real evidence that if they put a product out, it's going to be it's going to be successful. There's a market demand for it, and
And
maybe
isn't
they're
there an argument here too for the brands to educate the consumer a bit better about how certain choices within their brand are better for the environment or better for society, and having that part of the narrative as education of the consumer, which you don't often see in Japan very much, right?
yeah, totally. But I mean, it's whenever a when a category transforms in general, there's always some sort of new dimension of value, of benefit, that one of the brands has invented and then makes a big thing of, and sort of makes that actually that benefit core to the category. And they always invest in education for that. That's if it's cosmetics, it's through advertising in magazines, influencers, training your sales, your ambassadors in the shops to be able to really tell that story. I think sustainability is not going to be any different. But as you say, it's going to really behoove brands to create that sustainability win-win with the customer, and then educate them as to why it makes sense for themselves as well as for the whole of society. And this sort of expansion of, we talk about it as a sort of that space within which they can create value has just expanded, or is expanding, with sustainability consciousness. And in, let's say, if there's some molecule that's derived from a plant in a forest, that actually has a really beneficial effect on your skin health and radiance, which is really important things in a beauty category. But you need to protect the forest in order to continue to source that responsibly. You're creating a win-win between an environmental outcome, which is a protected and nurtured forest, and creating value which consumers will pay for.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of innovation that I think we'll start to see coming through. But it's really hard to do, and I think we mustn't underestimate when these massive juggernauts of companies, they've got all this inertia in these old models, and any kind of innovation is tough, but this one's going to be, this type is particularly tough.
Yeah.
But there are massive opportunities if they get it right.
Yeah, Tova has commented, we see the same issues inside companies. They want to have a positive impact, but don't know how. And that's why we need consultants like James and Tova and me working hard to work with companies and brands and help them think of ideas about how they can talk about the sustainable movements they're making, and which ones would suit their brand, right?
Exactly. And this, this shows, this is a bit of a set that shows, the positives that which when, that when they do get it right. So I feel proud when I buy a sustainable product, even if nobody else knows about it. So, these, and this is
I
interesting,
love
right?
that.
Because it validates our approach, I think, because those groups are based on consciousness of issues at a pretty high level. But then it is translating that the way that that's staggered into smaller and smaller groups shows that this consciousness and these other sort of dimensions of self-reported sort of attitude and behavior are really aligned with that. I try to buy brands that take action on social and environmental issues. So that low level, which is 67% of the population, that's at 25%. So it's pretty low, but it's not zero. And these, I think about the environment, social impact before buying. I research about it. Again, that sort of gets lower, but it's the more conscious you are, the more likely you are to be doing it. So that role for education that you just pointed out to, that's really important. Brands will be listened to. They are trusted in Japan, but there's also a role for mainstream media, for the NGOs, for it to be talked around the kitchen table over dinner. So yeah, I think education and is definitely, everything comes back to education ultimately, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We were
One of
talking
the
about
key
food at the
points,
start,
we've
right?
only got about 5 more minutes left. One of the key points was how Japanese consumers do prioritize or seem to prioritize food, more healthy food, more sustainable options for food, how the food choices affect the environment or society. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it makes sense. As we were talking about at the start, I think food is one of those areas where if you you can really tell on your taste, on your taste buds, if it's coming from if those vegetables have come from a farm that's treating the land properly. And so this ability to create synergy between the agricultural production and the food choices for the consumers is really key. And we're seeing this as a sort of kind of like a vanguard category that will sort of show the potential. And there are some really key concepts like provenance, knowing who made the product. That's really already sort of something we see a lot of in the food space and beverage as well. And that's only going to increase in other categories. And then, yeah, and this is around the sort of sensitivity to paying a premium. It's a bit of a trope. People report that they're happy to pay a green premium or a sustainability premium, but then do they actually in practice? What's interesting here is that all the different generations are saying to some extent that they would, ranging from Gen Z at the low end in the 20s to actually 60% for boomers. But then when you ask them how much, the boomers are more catchy. They're not, the amount extra they're prepared is lower than the Gen Z, where if they really like it, they're prepared to pay double for the non-sustainable option. And that's sort of like smaller but higher price tolerance is really symptomatic, I think, of the Gen Z mentality. I really want to get onto the packaging bit as well, because I know
Do we
I've heard
have
you
time? Can
talk
we
about
just go
packaging.
to packaging? I love that about willing to spend more on products and the differences with Gen Z. That's so interesting. But yeah, I would love to talk about packaging shifting ideas.
It's really exciting, I think, because Japan, just actually, if you look at the things which have changed since last year, probably these ones here around packaging are the biggest shifts. There is too much packaging in the products I buy. That's now at 91%. Packaging should be able to be recycled as many times as possible, now at 90%. More shops should offer refill options. That's a really progressive concept. I find it difficult to recycle packaging, which is a sort of an expressed frustration about the current state of things. So yeah, this is I think Japan's quite famous for its for packaging being part of its omotenashi sort of retail culture.
And you see people making big efforts to take those trays back to the supermarket, to be recycled. Like, people are washing it really diligently. It doesn't go out with the normal trash. They will make the effort to get it back to that recycling bin. And I think there is a lot of frustration there. Is it actually being recycled? Is it actually better for the environment? And this is another area where maybe the brands could educate the consumer and be a bit more transparent.
Yeah, totally. Is it being thermally recycled? They might ask. And I think these are really important questions. But it's, yeah, there's one there's one more slide here. Is I think this one's interesting for the e-commerce boom, right? There's too much packaging on the mail order parcels that I receive. I would switch brands to avoid excessive packaging, and I would pay more for eco-friendly packaging. It's really on the rise. So I think that's another real opportunity for brands, particularly ones, international ones, which maybe there's not they can't control everything at the Japan level, because they're a lot of the product R&D and manufacturing is done at the global level. But packaging is a very important sort of interface with the brand that could be leveraged more and send a signal that this and actually be used as an educational medium as well. To your point, JJ. So yeah, that was one of the areas we were excited about.
It was great to see that one of the companies you've been working with, James, is Amazon, talking about e-commerce and packaging. That can make a big difference. And it seems like they've improved from the packaging I've seen coming through over the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, I shouldn't give my clients a hard time, right? But we don't work with them on that area at all, to be honest. But right now, but yeah, no, we've certainly with our personal consumption here noticed that I have to spend less time ripping the plastic tape off the boxes, and I think that they have a really big opportunity to have a positive effect globally. Amazon have their planet pledge, which is, I think, showing leadership, but I'm sure they could do a lot more, I'm sure. But it's good to see progress in these core areas, isn't it?
And it's definitely an area where consumer agency or communicating from the consumer to the brand and asking for less packaging definitely helps. I have talked to farmers who I order from and asked them to just wrap in newspaper and boxes, and they have. I have asked, companies, please don't wrap it in plastic when you ship it. Is that okay? So I think there is a role for consumers, like you've been showing in your research, as well as how brands can change, but we also need consumers to communicate the desire for change too, right?
Yeah, and respectfully. And I think if I'm definitely become quite urusai at the that's okay, I don't need that extra bag, and would you mind putting it, I brought the tupper. It's like, no, are you sure you wouldn't like this plastic box to put it in, because it's going to be better? And I'm like, no, it's fine. Not trying, not sort of to be, it's not their fault. It's not like they're they're trying to do the right thing for you, the customer, which is a really great sort of a value, and it's to be praised. But the way we have a lot of opportunities ourselves at a personal level, like, you're right, to shift this and do it in a respectful way, doing it consistently, and making those small efforts, I think does have a really big role to play. I think that's Japan. No one likes to get left behind in Japan, right? I think tends to want to do things together, not to be the one that's sort of like holding society back. And that's, I think, with boomers in particular, that's a really big difference. They're really sort of active participants in the society and as consumers. And so if that kind of level of awareness and consciousness and agency can grow, we think you do see transitions happen really quickly in Japan. But it would be good if it got a move on. It's now time, right? So
well, your research, your survey here really helps illuminate a lot of the consumer mindset right now and how it has shifted slightly from last year. Do you think it's kind of positive? Are you hopeful for the future based on the survey?
Yeah, I think it's hard, like I say, I'm cautious to draw too much from it, but it is really encouraging. I was quite surprised when I saw some of the shifts in that time. And I think, overall, the biggest shifts are around sort of, let's say, consciousness and awareness rather than, say, action. So I think, you've now got these ideas of like, I want to have a positive effect on the environment. but that's at 52%. That's now the majority. That's definitely not being actioned on, right? So there's a sort of, I think you can look at, there's increasing the sense of agency and actually converting to action. We're now in that phase, so that is really encouraging. And I think one of the roles we want to play within this community and within this transition is for our data to help embolden decisions, to move discussions on further than if they didn't have that data. So, to be honest, usually we wouldn't recommend a particular company to make a big investment or change something based on this data. We would do a follow-up study specific to their category, and maybe do a whole lot more research as well. But maybe that project wouldn't have got off the ground if this data didn't exist. And so we'd really like to put it out there, as we did last year. We intend to release it as a download, and also to make the graphs, and there'll be more in the final report available to consultants who are working with clients on these decisions, so that they have them at hand to move those conversations on. So that's one of the ways we're hoping to give back. And I think, to your point, the data is certainly, the idea of all that insight and data getting into those conversations does make me really excited and encouraged about the speed with which things could move.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, James. And for people listening and watching, please reach out and find out more about James's company, Fabric, fbrc.co online. They have a great information in English as well as in Japanese. Thank you so much, James, for joining once again. I look forward to having you next year. Maybe
it's always
sooner.
fun. The time flies. Thanks so much, JJ. And congratulations to you on the growth of your channel.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and questions. We had some great engagement today, and hopefully even more as people watch it after, if they've missed us live. So hopefully they'll be writing their questions and comments, and we'll reply to them when we can. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, James.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a good day.